At Turning Point USA's 2019 Student Action Summit, we sit down with journalist Andy Ngo to discuss Antifa violence and the, quote, victimhood worldview. Andy Ngo, it's really great to have you on American Thought Leaders.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me here.
So, I've been watching your reporting for some time, especially related to Antifa. It's something that's been, something I've been trying to watch closely, and you've done some amazing and kind of very brave, frankly, work around that. I just came back from Hong Kong. I was there for 10 days, and I had a chance to interview one of these folks who's a frontline protester, basically, in Hong Kong. And one of these people that there's a lot of police action against. One of these people that believes that sometimes violence is even necessary. What struck me, though, talking to him, it was very, very interesting, is that he was very non-ideological. He was fighting for the freedom of his homeland, right? And it just struck me as this complete opposite of what these Antifa folk will stand for, which is to essentially, often to shut down discourse and speech in a violent way. What are your thoughts?
The Hong Kongers, who I greatly admire, the Hong Kong protesters, they are mobilizing for the rule of law, for free speech. In contrast to Antifa militants in the United States and Western Europe, they organize to destroy the country for a communist anarchist revolution. So on the surface, there are some similarities. You have many people who are wearing black or masks.
Right.
But beyond that, there's nothing really else that they have in common. Antifa goes out specifically to what they say is supposed fascism. In reality, in practice, what that means is physically confronting people who they ideologically oppose. So Antifa extremists have their hatred for other fellow citizens, whereas that's not the case in Hong Kong. It's pushing back against the literal system or the state. Yeah, I have so much admiration because they have so much to lose, and they're trying their hardest to hold on to it, what remains of the rule of law. Antifa is the complete 180 of that.
Right, and I just heard an interesting story someone told me today. They were on the Berkeley campus, and there was some kind of student protest or discussion happening, and there were two young ladies who were from Hong Kong, who were students there, and one of them, apparently quite a normally demure girl, basically couldn't take it anymore and said, "You guys have no idea what you have here. We're fighting for we're actually fighting for our freedom over there, and you guys think that you don't have freedom here. What are you talking about?" A lot of these folks that are attracted to Antifa, right, that are part of that group, or even some of the people that will shout down the kind of talk like you had today here with Michael Knowles, they genuinely feel threatened by what you are doing. And I find this fascinating. They believe that that there's freedom under threat, and even though I agree with you, it's definitely a 180 from Hong Kong, right? How does that work?
Well, they've been brought up in an environment where they are educated and told that speech is violence. And so the worldviews that are saturating a lot of not just the academy for young people, but news media, pop culture, it's really about instilling in people a sense of victimhood. I think a hatred for what this country stands for. It's really not even particularly controversial to be anti-American when you're on the mainstream left. All of that coming together has created, I think, this perfect storm for Antifa's extremism to be palatable to more people than it did before. The political context as well, currently we have fears that are stoked by irresponsible media and politicians about the current administration in making people, average people, fear that fascism is ascendant. And so this has been, the election of Trump is viewed by many, is a success for many patriots and nationalists, but it's also been a big success for far-left extremists because they're using the election results to mainstream their message.
So this is actually quite interesting. You know, you've been this idea around the culture of victimhood. This is something that's been obviously very important to you. I've seen that in your writing. Does this all originate on the campus right now? Where does this come from in your mind?
I think the theories that are underpinning these victimhood worldviews and ideologies are coming out of the academy because you have to look at the literature and the theories that were presented decades ago by some of these critical race theorists, critical gender theorists. They've provided the foundations for these more radical interpretations based on these theories to take place now. So I do blame the universities for the predicament that contemporary American society finds itself in.
It's hard for me to imagine how someone could rationally believe that they lack freedom on a typical US college campus. It's probably the most freedom that anyone's had in the history of the world, or something like that. I don't know if that might be overstating it a little bit, but it's hard for a lot of people to imagine, I think.
I think when somebody is born and bred in freedom, it's easy to spit on freedom, to take it for granted. That's all you know. You think that that's the baseline for how humanity organizes. It comes out of ignorance from not understanding cultures and societies around the world, that most of humanity's history has not had the privileges and stability that we see today in the 21st century. And I think with the victimhood culture and worldview, it's about finding offense not just at views that people disagree with. It's about having a reaction and to every microaggression. You know, they even just have developed concepts around these smaller aggressions and finding ways to feel aggrieved in any way possible. I think when somebody has bought into that view, it's really the only thing you become is bitter and resentful. So, and you feel like everything is out against you. And, you know, if you're a woman, let's say, then you will blame sexism. You could even be a white person, and then one thing I noticed, and this is not politically correct to say, is that there's a lot of people who are white in these extremist left-wing movements who then suddenly identify as queer or trans or non-binary to sort of give themselves another thing that they can use to point to and say that this is why I'm oppressed. So you can have a reason. My point is, one can have a reason or not have a reason in their worldview. It doesn't really matter. They'll come up with an excuse to be the perpetual victim. And my criticism of that worldview is not just that it keeps people stuck as victims. It creates hatred of others and eventually hatred of society around you. And I think people underestimate how widespread this hatred of America is.
You mean within America?
Yes.
Yeah, that's it. I hadn't honestly thought about it this way. It's very interesting that you say that. Is this the reason you are so committed to reporting on the reality of Antifa?
My commitment to reporting on the reality of Antifa and other left-wing violent extremist movements stems from what I see as a blind spot in the mainstream media when it comes to covering left-wing extremism. I mean, every publication has multiple journalists dedicated full-time to the beat of the far right or white supremacy or the alt-right. They have nothing for far-left extremists. So as a result, they frame a narrative that ignores a threat that exists in this country, or actively downplays it frequently. And I see Antifa not just dangerous because of the the street hooliganism that frequently comes with those extremist ideologies, but I see the mainstream left inching a little bit closer and closer to the radicalism in that they are normalizing many of the talking points of Antifa extremists. For example, the speech is violence mantra, the various claims based on intersectionality.
Just to clarify, what do you mean by that? I think I know the various claims made by intersectionality. Just give an example to our viewers. I think I know what you mean, but
intersectionality is a theory developed in academia, and to summarize it, it's basically oppression Olympics. The more variables that one has, they come together and intersect and make one, for example, a trans person of color is more oppressed than a poor white person, let's say. Even if that trans person of color comes from a privileged higher strata of economic background. It's because of these variables. So, and this is a connection at Antifa. So, Antifa as a movement originated during the interwar years in Germany.
Right.
And it was then incorporated into the official state ideology and rhetoric of the DDR, or East Germany.
Yes.
The American manifestation and phenomenon of Antifa is different than its European cousins in that they have adopted intersectionality and merged it with their anarchist communist beliefs. So at their events and all that, you'll see them talking much more about race and those who are able-bodied versus disabled and trans, much more than just talking about workers' unity or class.
Okay.
So this is different in the American manifestation, and because of that mutation, it's made them palatable to more people on the left, because they see the rhetoric that really is used by a lot of people on the mainstream left, so they don't recognize all the other extremist elements that go along with those beliefs.
Okay, and so one of those beliefs would be that violence is okay to express your dissent or to...
Not just that violence is okay, but that violence is needed.
Okay.
And that is the way to respond to fascism. But then, of course, you dig a little deeper, how they define fascism is, it means essentially anybody who's opposed to their ideology. So if somebody's an anti-communist or critical of communism, they would be branded as a fascist. That was similar to what East Germans did when they built the Berlin Wall, for example. They call that the anti-fascist defense barrier. So there's a whole history and tradition of the so-called anti-fascist calling their opponents fascists when just as a smear to give justification to either fight them, oppose them, or even try to kill them.
Right now, is the Antifa movement growing, getting smaller, stable in the U.S.? Where it's hard to know the trajectory, right? We just see these kind of moments where there's protests and we hear about them, but we don't really know that much about how it's developed. Probably you're one of the people that knows the most about these kinds of things. Yeah.
So Antifa existed on the fringes since the late 70s in the US, but it was really on the fringe. They were part of the subculture of the anarchist left-wing skinhead movement. But with the election of Donald Trump, it provided the perfect context for them to be launched sort of into the mainstream consciousness because of all these groups and influential individuals talking about how this is evidence of our country moving towards fascism.
Right.
Then they did gain a lot in membership, various Antifa groups. There's specific numbers we don't actually know. The memberships are secret. Officially, they would say they're anonymous, but they do have, some of the chapters do have members that have to go through a specific process of vetting before they become full-fledged members. People aren't aware of that. Their numbers are small in terms of the militants on the streets who are doing the fighting. But here's the thing, you really only need a small number of violent extremists to be potentially destabilizing for a region or even a country if the country is a weak state. So I never underestimate their violence, even though it is isolated and only happens even at its peak, maybe once a month, every month in Portland. The danger in Antifa is that their message has been mainstream. Like, their goal is to make the public believe that fascism is all around us and there are violent white supremacists all around us, and the way to respond is to oppose them physically. So it's led to these really bloody street brawls across America,
Right.
many of them in the Pacific Northwest, but they've also happened in Canada.
So they would say, hey, we're protecting against the white supremacists or white nationalists or something like this, right?
Yeah, so they entirely believe that they're justified in what they're doing. They believe actually that the violence they do is not just needed but noble, that they are protecting vulnerable communities. And who they include in the community, they say minorities, people of color, sexual minorities, left-wing workers. It's all rhetoric. It's an excuse for them to tap into their animalistic desires to be violent on the street. And that's, with the black bloc tactics, that's where they dress head to toe in black and wearing the mask. When they do that, it's to strip away the individual, because now you're no longer dealing with this person or this person, you're dealing as a mass, a block of people who are working towards one goal.
And also people can kind of function a bit with impunity because you can't tell who did it, right? They can just kind of melt into the crowd.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But as I said just a moment ago, I think that's not even the biggest concern we should have about Antifa. It's that political violence is normalized. It's not even controversial on the left to say things like fascists should be punched. And while many people may be sympathetic to that position when you're referring to people like Richard Spencer or something, but look at who these so-called anti-fascists are calling fascists. They're calling people like me. They're calling people
Absolutely.
like Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, just even centrists. So
Yeah.
This normalization of violence these are all huge victories for the Antifa movement, because they're able to move the Overton window that makes what was formerly a very fringe extremist ideology and street tactics now as seen as sort of, we need to do it, we need to. Even many of these so-called establishment protests that have happened in progressive cities, those leaders do nothing to expunge the extremist elements that show up. These sort of talking about, the left talks about dog whistles all the time. These people really do deploy dog whistles to bring the Antifa militants to come out and do nothing when they engage in violence.
So what do you see as the path forward here?
Well, I'll talk about what my criticisms against the left and far left have been on the record for a long time. I think what the right can do better is to actually humanize the left-wing extremists, because the goal of the people who are trying, the radicals on either the left or the right, they want to polarize society to a point of where we no longer view our ideological opponents as people anymore, as fellow citizens.
Yes.
Antifa is successful in brainwashing their comrades to believe that. You have to be really sociopathic to take bats and crowbars and bricks and attack people on the street that you don't know. And I see now on the right kind of a reaction in that they've been victimized so much at various riots against the conservatives that they sort of rebel when they see people revel in seeing people on the left getting injured or hurt. And that's not the way forward. I think we have to recognize that the left-wing ideologues have certain grievances that are not going away, and politicians need to address that, and politicians on the right as well. Not give in to their demands, because they make many demands, not to give in to that, but to recognize that they have certain grievances that need to be addressed. And there's a reason why the Democratic Socialists of America has had an explosion in their memberships. There's a reason why AOC is so influential, even just as one congresswoman. That message has a certain appeal, and it's my perception that conservatives or Republicans are not doing enough to draw back or draw into young people more towards, if not to the right, at least to a point of where they can believe in America as an ideal. In terms of addressing the street violence on the street, which is kind of the issues that are at the forefront, it's about giving law enforcement the tools to actually enforce the law. I don't think we need necessarily new laws, because so many things happen before a violent riot breaks out. You have, let's say in the case of Portland, you have people who are shutting down the streets, who are stopping traffic, all these things that are illegal that can be stopped way before it rises to the level of people hitting citizens with a crowbar on the skull. But for years now, the whole Black Lives Matter movement has been extremely successful in not just delegitimizing police, but politicizing police departments across the entire country, in that now every decision that a particular bureau makes is entirely politicized around these left-wing talking points. And so it's my view that there are so many political consequences for individual officers, but as well as departments and those leading departments, if they challenge left-wing orthodoxy, that they just sort of step back in progressive cities. And something else that I've been thinking about a lot is what the federal government can do in investing the resources into investigating the various Antifa networks in the US and their relationship to foreign organizations, particularly in Europe, the training that happens, the training materials that are shared, the extremist literature that is shared between the two continents. Like, we have already developed really sophisticated frameworks on addressing violent Islamism, for example. Yes. And I think these frameworks can apply for law enforcement to be investigating these Antifa networks. I mean, their process of radicalization is very similar. Their usage of Telegram and other untraceable online platforms and email network servers, so the tools are there. The threat needs to be realized. And my opposition to Antifa extremism is not out of a partisan reason. There are some people who I think are treating Antifa as just a political talking point. That's not what it is. It's really a movement that seeks to destabilize this country, ultimately, and hoping to overthrow it. If they cannot, what we're seeing now is they realize that they can have a lot of success through the legal democratic process, which is why they are getting sympathizers onto city councils and as mayors and even into Congress. So this fringe element has already moved into the mainstream. We have to address it now. It's growing, it appeals to young people, and yeah, I feel like many people on the right are just sort of sitting there and have a lot to say but not much to do.
Do you see yourself as conservative?
I describe myself as center-right. I was reluctant to describe myself as so, but I've been asked so many times, and I think conservative is fair. I'm not so much a political partisan, but what makes me conservative, for example, is that I'm unapologetically very grateful for the citizenship that I have in the United States. So I am.
That's a conservative position these days. That's interesting, isn't
it? Patriotic and being pro-America is considered reactionary and right-wing. So because of that, and because of my open criticism of communism and Marxism, I've been described as conservative for that. And I think really what I want to see preserved are the norms of a liberal democracy that have allowed our culture and society to flourish and to do well. I didn't really start embracing my citizenship and my identity as an American until I traveled to actually my parents' country of origin and seeing the freedoms that are not afforded to the citizens there. It puts a lot of things into perspective. So, I don't have the luxury of some of my white left-wing activists in Portland who are so ignorant about the rest of the world. All they see is they perceive every microaggression as evidence of America being such an oppressive society that there are people out to kill them at any moment. I think the first time that I was really exposed to this victimhood worldview was in 2015. I was a graduate student at Portland State at that time, and one of the new events they had was an event called Students of Color Speak Out. And it kind of appealed to me, the name at least. I thought it was kind of interesting. This was 2015. As many of the listeners and viewers may recall, is when we had the explosion of all the social justice rage on campuses across the country, at Mizzou, at Yale, at many other places. Well, we had that happen in Portland as well. But I went to this event, and one of the rules of this open mic event was that if you weren't a person of color, in other words, if you were white, you were not allowed to speak. And it was just kind of like, in listening to peer after peer going on the microphone, talking about how they were literally fearing for their lives, that they had to look over their shoulders because at any moment a white supremacist could massacre them on campus. Like, they actually really believed this, and it was encouraged. This type of panic was encouraged by the administration. You know, when people are socialized until various forms of mental illness, no wonder they feel justified in masking up and taking to the streets and destroying properties and attacking people. Like, you know, when you kind of when you are exposed to their worldview and you understand it, it contextualizes the craziness. And, you know, I have a certain amount of sympathy for these people. I think a lot of them are unwell, and the solution is not to give in and to indulge their suffering and their delusions, but to get them on track to being grounded in reality. But unfortunately, not just our professors and administrators at universities, but just listening to the rhetoric of Democratic politicians who are running for president, like at the LGBT town hall. This type of, the radicalism is mainstream. And so as long as that continues to happen, Antifa's violent extremism will continue to be excused. We'll see it grow as a movement. And if Trump is to win re-election, we're going to likely see repeats of what we saw in 2016, people rioting in the streets. We had 3 days of violent rioting in Portland.
One more question, Andy. Have you had any success in, reaching out to someone who's been, as you said, kind of, socialized this way, and kind of helping them not see themselves as this perpetual victim?
I've tried a lot, actually, but before the targeted, people are familiar with me because I was beaten and robbed at the end of June by mass Antifa militants, and I was partially caught on video. But before that, I have been documenting protests and riots in Portland for years, actually.
Yes.
But things have been escalating by people, sympathizers, or people who are part of Antifa. In the beginning, when they tried to, for example, damage my camera equipment or physically block me from recording public demonstrations, I tried to talk with them, like, person to person, and I realized it was kind of impossible, because when they were hiding behind the mask, you're not, and they're wearing sunglasses, you can't even see to the eyes. They're not, I was not speaking to an individual, I was speaking to one part of the Antifa black bloc. So they couldn't see me as a person, they saw me only as fascist propagandist, so on and so forth. And it was actually not just disheartening, it was very sad. The first time when this happened in 2018, these people who didn't know who I was but had all these views about me that were wrong, and I couldn't even just have a normal conversation with them. It's just all they had that was rage and emotion. But related to what you asked, I have had people reach out to me to say, I really disagree with you, I support what Antifa does, but I think what they did to you was wrong, and I'm willing to speak with you. And of course I have to keep all those conversations in confidence and private, because they would face repercussions just for even if their comrades knew that they were just even willing to have a conversation with me. So this goes back to what I was saying a moment ago about having to humanize those we really disagree with. Because I think for those few individuals, they saw that I wasn't this violent extremist that they have been told. And I think, I hope with all my speaking out and my outspoken criticism of Antifa, it's not that I want these people to be hurt. If they have done criminal activities, they need to be held liable in the justice system. But I want them to be de-radicalized. I have At the end of the day, there are people who have grievances that many people do, and they've chosen to take a radical path. For that, they don't deserve to be killed or jailed. And they need to be held accountable when they destroy property, when they injure people, when they kill other people. I hope that someone, a few in their movement, can see that I'm not this embodiment of evil that they think I am.
Well, I think it's remarkable that you have this that you have this approach of keeping everyone humanized. I think this is a lesson we all need to learn better. It's such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you for having me on.